In this video, we're going to wrap up our discussion of Mealy's book on free will. We're going to be talking about what should we make of the scientific evidence and its relation to free will overall. In this video, we're going to start out by reviewing those three concepts of free will we introduced earlier in the course. And then we'll talk about evidence and how that plays into discussions of the modest free will, the ambitious free will, and the supernatural free will. And that's going to lead us into a discussion of Mealy's explanation for why scientists often deny the existence of free will. And Mealy's explanation is largely going to rely on this idea that scientists have a particular meaning in mind that oftentimes differ from the ways that philosophers think about the meaning of free will. And that's going to lead us into a discussion, well, could there be any evidence to help us decide between the different proposed meanings of free will? So the last chapter of Mealy's book revolves around this question. What is the evidence for or against the existence of free will? Now, Mealy points out that the answer to this question really depends on what you actually mean by this phrase, free will. If you mean one thing, maybe we have good evidence for it. If you mean another thing, maybe we have good evidence against it. And so we need to be careful at distinguishing these. And as we've seen, philosophers and many people disagree about what's the best way to define free will. So let's review those three competing conceptions of free will we discussed earlier. Remember, Mealy has a kind of gas station analogy. At the gas station, you can get regular, mid-grade, or premium gas. Similarly, different definitions have a kind of like regular free will, mid-grade free will, and premium free will, where the premium involves the sort of most demanding sort of ideas. So the modest free will, this sort of analog of regular grade gas, says that in order to have free will, a person must be responsive to reasons, so these internal influences, their own beliefs, desires, preferences, their weighing of pros and cons. And they need to be free from excessive manipulation, coercion, or force. So this sort of external influence, such as a person holding a gun to their head. And according to the modest notion, this is sufficient for free will. According to the ambitious notion of free will, this is the analog of mid-grade gas. It says, look, yes, you do need to be responsive to reasons. You need to be free from excessive manipulation, coercion, or force. But that's not enough to have free will on this view. They say, in addition to that, the person must have the ability to have chosen otherwise, even under identical conditions. So the idea here is go to the moment right before they made a decision. They only have free will if they could choose more than one option, even if you keep everything else exactly the same leading up to the decision. That's the idea of that deep openness we talked about. The supernatural free will says even deep openness is not sufficient for having free will. They think, in addition, the person must have a non-physical mind or soul that's in control of their choices. Or probably even more appropriately, the person must be a non-physical mind or soul. So the person just is this non-physical part of themselves, and that non-physical part is what's in control of what their body is doing, for instance. So we can take these three conceptions of free will and reflect on what evidence we have for or against each one of them individually. So let's start out with the modest conception. Remember, according to this, free will involves a person's ability to make decisions on the basis of their own reasoning and free of that excessive manipulation, coercion, or force. So what evidence do we have that people have this ability? Well, according to Mealy, he says, look, your life provides you with evidence that this ability is sometimes at work in you and in people you interact with. So the idea is our own firsthand experience gives us some initial evidence that people have this ability and have free will in this sort of modest conception. And that's because, look, oftentimes you make choices and it seems like you're making them on the basis of your weighing of the pros and cons. You made a choice about where to go to school or whether to go to school at all. You thought about the advantages, the disadvantages, and you made a choice. And you see other people oftentimes weigh the pros and cons, and it seems like that explains why they make the choices that they do. Now, someone might appeal to neuroscience experiments such as Libet's in an attempt to show that we lack this ability to make decisions on the basis of our own conscious reasons. by trying to argue that we never make conscious decisions. And someone might appeal to social psychology experiments in an attempt to give evidence that we lack this ability as well, that our decisions are actually the result of these external influences sort of manipulating us, as opposed to our own internal reasoning sort of causing those choices. However, we've already discussed why Mealy thinks that such experiments fall short of proving that we don't have this ability to do things on the basis of our own internal sort of reasoning. And so Mealy wants to say our own experience gives us evidence that we meet this modest conception of free will, and the evidence against it, we've seen the problems with it, and thus we should stick with our experience here as the best evidence we have thus far. All right, so let's turn to the ambitious conception of free will. Now notice we've already said it looks like we have sort of no reason to doubt so far that we have modest free will. But the ambitious conception says, well, that's not enough to have free will. You also have to have deep openness to your decisions. And so now the question becomes, do we have evidence for or against this kind of deep openness in our decisions? You might say, well, what about our experience? Doesn't that still provide us with evidence not just of the modest free will, but even of deep openness in our decisions? So when we're unsure about what to do and mulling it over, it feels like more than one decision is open to us. And so because of that, you might think, doesn't that give us some evidence that our decisions have deep openness? But now Mealy says, but what would it feel like if, in fact, alternative decisions weren't open to us in the deep way required by ambitious free will? So on that hypothesis that there is not deep openness, that the world is deterministic, what would we think that our experience, what would we think our decisions would feel like in such a world? Mealy says, look, the answer to the best of my knowledge is this: just the way it normally feels, just the way things feel now. And so the idea is, look, if the world is deterministic or indeterministic, our decisions would likely feel exactly the same. And so our experience doesn't seem to give us any evidence one way or the other about whether our decisions have deep openness or not. So your not knowing what you will decide is one thing, but having deep openness regarding what you will decide is another. And so the idea here is, look, it feels like you're oftentimes unsure about what to do, and it feels like both decisions are open to you because you don't have all the information, and so you don't know what you're going to do before you make the decision. But the idea is that might just feel that way because you are ignorant of all the factors that go into that decision. And so even if there's information that determines it, since you're not aware of that information, you sort of don't feel like you're determined to make one decision or the other. It's kind of like when you watch a movie for the first time. Notice the script is already written, but since you don't know what's going to happen, it feels like maybe there's different options, there's different ways the movie could go. But the movie's already written, you just don't know what the script is, and that's why it feels like there's different ways the movie might go in the future. And the idea is here, look, I can't taste the difference between Coke and Pepsi, and as I see it, no one can feel the difference between deep openness and its absence. And so the idea here is just, since on the hypothesis that our decisions have deep openness, compared to the hypothesis that we live in a deterministic universe, we wouldn't expect our experience to feel any different either way, and so our experience doesn't provide evidence about what kind of world we live in. But is there any scientific evidence for the existence or non-existence of deep openness? Well, none of the experiments that we've discussed show that brains work deterministically. And so none of them have ruled out deep openness. So remember, the best predictive accuracy we saw from any of these experiments about previous brain states was about 80%. And so that does not close the door on deep openness yet. However, that doesn't give us evidence that our brains work indeterministically either. And so in this sense, sort of both determinism and indeterminism seem to be live options. We don't know which one is true about the brain. At least judging from these experiments that we've discussed. The book does mention a fruit fly study that some scientists have used to try to argue that there is a kind of deep openness to our decisions. Fruit flies have much simpler sort of brains than we do, but some scientists have claimed to get evidence that no matter how much information you have about the sort of brains of fruit flies, you wouldn't be able to predict a very simple decision like whether they'll go left or right in a certain case. And so maybe that gives some evidence of deep openness, perhaps. Other people might appeal to quantum mechanics. So quantum mechanics is a theory in physics about very, very small things and how they work. That says essentially, when you get really, really small, the way things work can only be determined probabilistically rather than deterministically. You can never get certainty. And the claim is that this is a fundamental part of the world. It's not just a matter of us missing information. That is, even if you have all the information about these particles at the very small level, you could still only predict their behavior with probabilities. All right. So even ambitious free will is a live option, according to Mealy. Now, one thing I should say about this quantum mechanics, though, is that even if quantum mechanics is true, that doesn't show that our decisions have deep openness, because it depends upon whether or not when we go to, say, the level of the brain rather than the level of the atom, maybe all those probabilities sort of cancel each other out when we get sort of large enough so that maybe the brain still works deterministically. So the idea here is, look, we don't have evidence to decide one way or the other quite yet. It's still an open option, and that might depend upon where science goes in the future. Well, what about the supernatural conception of free will? Well, Mealy says, because the discussion of evidence for and against the existence of souls is beyond my range, I'll concentrate on the two conceptions that don't invoke souls. So Mealy's point here is, on the supernatural conception, in order to decide if that's really a possibility for people, we need to determine what evidence there is for and against the existence of a soul. And that's really difficult and complicated. And he doesn't have time to sort of go into that sort of here. And so he's going to focus on the maybe more down-to-earth definitions, the modest and the ambitious definitions, as opposed to that supernatural one. But we still might ask about the evidence for this notion of free will. And this is going to be questions about, is there any evidence that human persons are more than just an extremely complex physical animal? Or is there any evidence that people are merely, so only, complex physical animals? Now, most scientists and philosophers alive today believe that there actually is good evidence and arguments to think that people are nothing more than sort of physical creatures. They don't have a non-physical component like a soul. And if they're right, that would rule out the existence of supernatural free will. So we're going to put that to the side for now, and we'll consider that question in detail when we get to the philosophy of mind unit here. So Mealy believes that he has shown that given the scientific evidence about the way the world works, about neuroscience, and about social psychology, he thinks all of that evidence leaves open the possibility of both modest and ambitious free will. And he doesn't really comment on supernatural free will because I don't think he's not particularly sympathetic to that view of free will in the first place. But if the scientific evidence leaves open the possibility of at least those two kinds of free will, why do so many scientists seem to think that free will has been proven to be an illusion by this evidence? Well, Mealy explains, here's a short answer. Because they set the bar for the existence of free will extremely high. And he gives the example of a great baseball player analogy. If someone asks, are there any great baseball players? And now imagine you say that, well, in order to be a great baseball player, someone has to have a 400 batting average. Now, I don't actually know anything about baseball, but apparently this is really good. I don't know, because I don't know baseball statistics. But the idea is that standard for the great baseball player is set so high that no human being could ever sort of meet it. And so it's no surprise that on that view, someone might come to the conclusion that there do not exist any great baseball players. Mealy thinks something similar is going on with scientists. They set the bar so high for free will, it's not a surprise that we think that nobody reaches that bar. But that's because they're setting the bar too high. Now, Mealy mentions two ways that someone might set the bar for free will absurdly high. Someone might have the view that having free will requires making conscious choices that are entirely independent of brain activity. Or someone might have the view that having free will requires being absolutely unconstrained by genetics and environment, including the situations in which we find ourselves. Now look, we have good evidence that our decisions never meet either of these standards. Our decisions are at least somewhat influenced by what's going on in our brain, and our decisions are at least somewhat influenced by our environment and genetics. I mean, I already knew that before I read anything about Libet's experiments or about the Stanford Prison experiment. I knew that from my own sort of experience. Someone gets hit on the head and they forget things and start making weird decisions. Or when someone's under the influence of drugs, that changes their brain and they make different decisions. When someone is around friends and have sort of peer pressure, they make different decisions than they'd make if they weren't in that environment. Those are ordinary things to observe that is not surprising whatsoever. And so the idea here is, look, we shouldn't think that free will requires meeting such a huge bar that we're completely and utterly independent of brain activity and completely uninfluenced by our genetics or environment, because obviously we don't meet those, and so we shouldn't think that free will requires meeting such absurd standards. Now, even if we don't set the bar for free will as high as those two ideas mentioned on the previous slide, many scientists do seem to assume that the supernatural or premium grade definition of free will is correct. And I think there is some reason to think that maybe the scientific evidence could possibly challenge that conception, maybe. Now, Mealy quotes a passage from Current Biology where Montague writes the following. Montague writes, "Free will is the idea that we make choices and have thoughts independent of anything remotely resembling a physical process. Free will is the close cousin to the idea of the soul, the concept that you, your thoughts and feelings derive from an entity that is separate and distinct from the physical mechanisms that make up your body. From this perspective, your choices are not caused by physical events, but instead emerge wholly formed from somewhere indescribable and outside the purview of physical descriptions. This implies that free will cannot have evolved by natural selection, as that would place it directly in a stream of causally connected events." So notice, this is evidence that Mealy is correct, that at least some scientists seem to be assuming this sort of supernatural definition of free will. And Mealy also quotes biologist Anthony Cashmore, who says, "If we no longer entertain the luxury of a belief in the magic of the soul, then there's little else to offer in support of the concept of free will." And one last example. In his 2011 book, Who's in Charge? Free Will and the Science of the Brain, neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga says that free will involves a ghostly or non-physical element and some secret stuff that is you. See it again. We have three examples of scientists that are skeptical that free will exists, seeming to be assuming that in order for there to be free will, there would have to be this sort of magical, supernatural soul that is sort of in control and sort of outside of the physical universe. However, most contemporary philosophers who believe that we do have free will don't think of it as something magical, supernatural, or non-physical. Most philosophers who believe in free will believe that humans are entirely physical, and they explicitly reject the existence of immaterial minds or souls. So it looks like the sort of pessimistic scientists and the optimistic philosophers mean different things by free will, and they're sort of talking past one another to some extent. Well, I mean, of course, there are pessimistic philosophers. There are philosophers who are also skeptical of free will. But I'm talking about the ones that believe in free will still don't seem to believe in anything that the scientists say by free will. So the pessimistic scientists are using free will to pick out a supernatural idea that operates outside the physical laws of the universe, whereas the optimistic philosophers have a more down-to-earth idea of free will that's perfectly consistent with our living in a world that's entirely physical, entirely described by the sciences. So how do we decide who has the correct meaning of free will? Is it the scientists who define free will as some supernatural magical thing? Or is it these philosophers who define it as something non-magical, something that's consistent that could exist in a purely physical world? Notice the fact that someone is a scientist doesn't give them any special expertise or authority about what a phrase or word or idea such as free will means or what it should mean. Now, maybe being a philosopher doesn't give you any special expertise there either, though that does get a little bit sort of tricky. And so the scientists are telling you what they mean by free will, and the philosophers seem to be telling you what they mean by free will, and they're different. They might think, well, to each their own. But how do we decide then whether free will exists? How do we decide which of their definitions we should go with? Well, how do we decide where we ought to set the bar? Well, here's 2 suggestions for how we might make progress in figuring out which definition we should go with. First, there's a field of philosophy that's sort of rising known as experimental philosophy. And these are philosophers that attempt to take philosophical ideas and bring them to the masses by giving sort of examples, by giving situations, by giving prompts, and then trying to survey ordinary people regarding, well, what would you say about this situation? Would you say that the person acted of their free will? Or would you say that they didn't? And then give them another situation. And the idea is by doing these surveys on ordinary people, by getting more and more samples, that can give us some insight into what the ordinary common meaning of this term is, besides just our own meaning. Another potential strategy is to focus not on how we ourselves, maybe our own intuitions about how to define free will, but maybe reflect on what work we want to do with the idea of free will, and then try to think, how would we have to define free will in order for it to do that work? And this is why many philosophical discussions of free will often reflect on considerations of moral responsibility. That is, in order to hold someone morally responsible for their actions, they'd have to be able to perform those actions sort of freely of their own free will. We wouldn't blame someone who hit a person in the face due to an epileptic seizure because they weren't in control. They didn't cause that pain of their own free will, and so we don't blame them for that bad outcome. And so the idea is, if free will is supposed to distinguish between the actions we can hold people morally accountable for and those that we can't, well, then we can think, how do we need to define free will in order for it to sort of make sense of moral responsibility? And that can help us figure out how we should define it. Now, there's an analogy here between deciding how to define the phrase the best student. Imagine one professor defines the best student as the student with the highest GPA, overall GPA. Imagine another professor defines the best student as the student with the highest GPA in their own major. And imagine another professor defines the best student as the one that wrote the most creative essay. So they all have different definitions of the best student. They all have their own. And you might say, well, to each their own, it doesn't really sort of matter. You can define things however you want. Well, not if they have to decide on which student is going to be getting a scholarship. And maybe there's only one scholarship, and it's supposed to go to the best student. Well, at that point, in order to decide between those 3 definitions, you might say, well, given that we want to decide who gets a scholarship, which of these criteria would be best for achieving those goals of distinguishing who should get the scholarship and who shouldn't? And now you can reflect on a number of value judgments to figure out, well, which definition would best achieve those goals. Similarly, given that you want free will to be connected to moral responsibility, what's the best way to define it to help achieve those goals? Here's another thought to consider in this regard. There's a big difference between proving that something works differently than we originally thought and proving that it doesn't exist altogether. So here's a couple analogies. Imagine someone who sees all these cars moving across the street, driving along, but they believe that the way cars work is that when you open up the hood, they believe that you'd find little mini horses running on treadmills, sort of powering the cars to move. Now imagine you open up a hood of a car and you show them inside that there is nothing there. There's just an engine. There's no horses, no treadmills. this person wouldn't come to the conclusion, they wouldn't say, oh my gosh, cars don't exist. There are no cars. There's these other things that aren't really cars. They aren't real cars because they don't have horses in them. They'd say, oh, I guess cars work differently than I thought. Similarly, Dan Dennett gives the example of love and Cupid. So there's this myth that there's this sort of angel Cupid that sort of shoots people with arrows and causes them to fall in love. Well, now imagine you come to the belief that Cupid doesn't exist. That wouldn't lead you to believe that there is no such thing as love. You just come to the conclusion that I guess love works differently than we thought. Something a little bit more sort of relevant here, maybe more close to home. Imagine someone comes to the conclusion that people don't have a non-physical soul or mind. They think, well, people are just complex animals, and oftentimes you wouldn't come to the conclusion that, well, because we're just sort of purely physical beings, you wouldn't usually conclude, thus, I guess we don't have a mind. I guess we don't have beliefs or desires or memories or personalities or goals or emotions. Usually what you'd say is, I guess emotions, I guess the mind, emotions, beliefs, memories work differently than we thought. They're not things that are happening in a non-physical part of us, but it's just things happening in the brain. So on this, the idea is, as you learn about how the world works, you wouldn't come to the conclusion that minds don't exist. You would come to the conclusion that minds just work differently. They work in a physical way as opposed to the supernatural way that many people believed. So similarly, if we find out that souls don't exist, maybe what we should come to the conclusion is not that we don't have free will, but that free will works differently than we originally thought. That is, we originally thought that, so free will is this idea that you are sort of in control of your decisions and behavior. Now, if you think that you are this non-physical thing, then you think, okay, and so the way free will works is that you, this non-physical thing, are in control of all the things that are going on physically in your body, for instance. But then when you find out that there is no non-physical thing, well, you might still think, well, maybe you, what you are, is still in control of your decisions and behavior. It's just what you are isn't a non-physical thing. And so the way you have control over your body and your actions, your behavior and your decisions works differently than we thought. So the way free will works is different. We shouldn't come to the conclusion that free will just doesn't exist. And so Dan Dennett is one philosopher who defends the modest conception of free will and believes that free will exists even in a universe that's entirely physical and largely deterministic. And so when he discusses free will, he often cites the following passage from Lee Siegel's book, Net of Magic, Wonders of Deception in India. So Lee Siegel says, I'm writing a book on magic. I explain, and I'm asked, real magic? By real magic, people mean miracles, thaumaturgical acts, and supernatural powers. No, I answer. Conjuring tricks, not real magic. Real magic, in other words, refers to magic that is not real, while the magic that is real, that can actually be done, is not real magic. So Dennett thinks that something similar is going on with discussions of free will. People define free will as a sort of supernatural, sort of miraculous thing, and he thinks, well, when you do that, obviously he thinks free will doesn't exist. But then when someone tries to explain how free will works in a way that's sort of more down to earth, that's consistent with the way the world works, their response is, okay, yeah, I guess that can happen, but that's not real free will. And so it's weird. The idea is people tend to think that, well, real free will is this kind of magical free will that maybe we can't have, but the things that we can have, like control, reasoning over our decisions, behavior, they say, well, that's just not real free will. That seems like a weird sort of response. Maybe what we should start wanting is something more down to earth. Maybe we shouldn't be setting the bar so high for supposedly real free will. So that's it for this video. It wraps up our discussion of Mealy's book. Next, we're going to turn to a discussion of some questions about the relationship between free will, addiction, mental disabilities, and moral responsibility. See you then. Bye-bye.